Hello, my name's Aviva, and today I'll be recommending a couple of my favorite fantasy series that have amazing romances in them. When I find a fantasy series that has a very heavy romance going on in it, it usually ends up becoming one of my favorite series of all time. Mostly because I'm just a huge fan of romances in my fantasy. But when you're reading a fantasy, you'll often find that the romance in the story is usually like a side thing, just something else that is going on with the characters, but usually like, the political situation or the war or whatever the plot is actually about is usually like the forefront of the story, and the romance is just like a side thing that you get to follow. But in all of the books that I'm about to share with you guys, the romance is actually an extremely important part to the story, and that is why these are some of my favorite series of all time. So without further ado, let me just share them with you. So the first books I wanted to talk about is probably going to be very obvious to you if you've been to my channel before, and that is all of the books by Sarah J. Maas. So Throne of Glass, A Court of Thorns and Roses, and even Crescent City. The thing is I am not going to spend any time talking about these because these are extremely popular series, and actually right before this video came out, I did an entire beginner's guide to Sarah J. Maas. So if you wanted to know more about these series, what they're about, how to read them, all of that sort of good stuff, I'll link the video up on the screen as well as down below so that you could check out the details about these books. But all I'm going to say is that these might be the heaviest romances I've ever found in fantasy series to date. They are some of my favorite romances of all time, as well as my favorite fantasy series of all time. So really, I couldn't recommend these anymore, but if you wanted to know more, make sure to watch that beginner's guide to Sarah J. Maas video. So next up, I wanted to talk about the Bargainer series by Lauren Thalassa. So this is actually the book that inspired this entire video. I just finished reading this series last night and I absolutely loved it, and it basically made me very in the mood to talk about fantasy series that have a lot of romance in it. So if you're not familiar with what this book is about, this is an adult high fantasy series about a siren and a bargainer. Basically, it's an urban fantasy, so it technically takes place in our real world, but honestly, it doesn't really feel like an urban fantasy. It feels very much like a high fantasy series. But either way, the siren, the bargainer, they basically made a bunch of deals a long time ago, and the story starts out where the bargainer comes back to the siren and is coming to collect all of his deals. And obviously a lot more is going to happen other than that, but the first book is basically following two storylines. You're basically following them 7 or 8 years ago as they were becoming friends and making all of these deals for whatever reason, and throughout the story you're going to learn why they were making these deals and how their friendship started and all that stuff. But obviously something happened a long time ago that made them cut ties with each other, and basically you're also following 8 years later as the bargainer has come back to basically collect all of the deals that they've made. So it's a very interesting story, and it really goes a lot of places. I don't really want to say what the overarching story is about, only because I think it's a spoiler. So all you need to know is that it starts out with the bargainer, the siren, they made a bunch of deals and now he's coming to collect, and basically it's amazing. It has a very good romance in it. I absolutely loved it, and I really have nothing else really to say about it. All I'm going to say is that if you are into adult high fantasy stories that have really good romances in it, then definitely check it out for yourself. So next up, I wanted to talk about From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout, which I've actually spoken about a lot recently on my channel, only because I recently read this series and I've been kind of obsessed with it lately, so I can't really stop talking about it. But either way, this is another adult high fantasy, and it's basically about this girl and this guy, and there's going to be a really big romance. I don't really know what more to say. It's basically very similar to A Court of Thorns and Roses. If you are a fan of Sarah J. Maas's work, I definitely recommend checking this out. I don't really want to say too much about what the fantasy series overall is about, only because I do think it's a spoiler, because in the back it doesn't really give you much about what the overarching story is. It kind of just says that the main girl, she is chosen, and she basically is this really big up person in society, and she really doesn't like the position that she's in, so she's very defiant and all that sort of good stuff. And I don't know, the story starts out where she goes to this brothel one night against everybody's wishes. She's not really allowed to do any of that sort of stuff, but she goes to the brothel, she ends up meeting this guy, and things go from there. Ends up being this guy is going to end up being her new bodyguard, and romances are gonna bloom, things are gonna happen, high fantasy wars, things at stake, all that sort of good stuff. It's just great. But all I'm gonna say is that if you are a huge fan of romance in your fantasy, then this is the series for you. If you like Sarah J. Maas, you're gonna like this. If you like this, you're gonna like Sarah J. Maas. There's really no question about it. So definitely check it out if it sounds like something up your alley. So next up, I have one more adult fantasy series to share with you guys, and that is The Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. So this is an adult urban fantasy about this girl who is a witch, and she is a professor professor at Oxford, and the story basically starts off where she goes to the library to do some research for like her alchemy project or whatever. She's either an alchemist or she just studies the history of alchemy, something like that. Either way, she ends up getting a book from the library, and it ends up being a magical book. So she opens it up, realizes it's full of magic, but she doesn't want anything to do with her powers or her like witch ancestry and all that sort of stuff. So she closes it up and puts it back on the stack. But the fact that she opens up that book actually sends like a magical like ripple effect throughout all of the like magical people in the world. There's basically vampires, demons, and witches all living amongst humans. Humans don't really know that they exist because they look like normal people, but they technically are all around us. So either way, all of them feel this effect from this book that she opens up, and they all start coming to the library to try to get their hands on this book. And basically the story kind of starts off where the vampire comes to the library, ends up meeting this witch, and basically a romance is going to bloom between the two of them, and it's going to be a really great romance. But besides for that, you're also following this storyline of this book that she kind of lost after she put it away, because it showed up for her once, and then when she tries to get it back, then she can't get it back, and it's a whole thing. There's so much stuff that happens in this book that I really don't want to touch upon because it's going to be spoilers. So all I'm going to say is that it's an amazing story. Besides for the romance aspect of it, which is absolutely amazing, it's really high on the romance, you also have this great storyline that you're following. So if I piqued your interest in it, I definitely recommend just checking it out for yourself, because I don't think you're going to be disappointed. So next up, I have A Kiss of Deception by Mary A. Pearson. So this is a collection of 3 books, and it's basically a high fantasy world, except there's not actually like magic going on in this universe. It's one of these like fantasy stories that just don't take place in our real world. The continent is different, the kingdoms, all of that sort of stuff. It feels very much like a fantasy, except nobody's actually got like magical power. So I just thought I'd like point that out right at the beginning, because you know, you don't always come across that. Usually in fantasy stories, there is some sort of magical thing going on. But either way, this is just a different world fantasy of sorts, and you're following this girl. She's a princess, and she's basically supposed to marry this prince that she's never met before, just so that like both of their kingdoms could get this like political alliance of sorts. But either way, she really doesn't want to marry a guy that she's never met. So the day of her wedding, she decides to run away from her family and pretend to be a normal person in a different part of the kingdom and just live her life. And the story starts off where this prince is very insulted, so he decides that he is going to go after her and see who is this girl that stood him up at the altar. But then you're also following one more storyline of this assassin who is from another kingdom who is after the princess as well, but to kill her. So you're following 3 storylines: the princess, the prince, and the assassin. There is going to be like wars of sorts. Obviously, you're like dealing with a lot of different kingdoms that are all like not really politically aligned, things like that. So it's an overall great fantasy story about like wars and politics and things like that. But then you're also following these 3 people as romances are going to occur between all 3 of them. So it starts off as kind of a love triangle, but also like it's not going to end that way, obviously. Either way, it's really great. It is very high on the romance, and if you are into young adult fantasy stories that have romances in it, I definitely think you should check this out. And I figured while we're on the topic of A Kiss of Deception, I should mention A Dance of Thieves, which actually is a second series in this universe. It takes place like 7 or 8 years later after The Kiss of Deception is over, and you're following like one of these side characters from the original story as she's now older, and she's going to have a romance for herself. I don't really want to say too much more because, you know, I don't want to spoil anything from the original series. So all I'm going to say is that if you end up loving A Kiss of Deception, there is actually a duology that takes place after it, and this is actually more romance-filled than the original Kiss of Deception. And if you read that one, you're gonna be like, wait, I thought that one was like really heavy on the romance. Yeah, just wait until you get to this one. So either way, if you read The Kiss of Deception, just be aware that there is a duology that takes place after it, following side characters from the original trilogy, and it's a great story also. And lastly, I saved the best for last, except I actually can't really say that because all of these series are absolutely amazing. But I did want to tell you guys about the Trial series by Amanda Hocking, which is one of my favorite series of all time. It's actually my longest favorite series. I read this back in middle school, and it's what made me fall in love with fantasy. I've talked about it a lot on my channel before, but I'm talking about a video that has romances in their fantasy, so I can't help but talk about this. So if you're not familiar, this is a young adult urban fantasy story about this girl who finds out that she is a changeling, and she actually was switched at birth for a normal human baby, and she is now being asked to come back to her fairy queen mother, who is going to like now take care of her because she really is a troll, and she's got to go live with trolls and not humans because she doesn't really fit in there. So either way, she goes back to this like troll society. She finds out out that her mother is a queen, she is a princess, and that she actually has a lot of magical powers. So you're gonna follow her as she, is like coming into being herself, finding out she's a princess, learning how to use her magic. But then there's also going to be a war that's happening between her trial community and another trial community. So it's really interesting, really love it. There's going to be a couple of romances in these books that are some of my favorite romances of all time. So that's all I'm gonna say about that. If you haven't read this book yet, you really, really should, because it is absolutely amazing. So anyway, that is all of the books that I'm gonna be sharing with you guys today, but I actually have so many more books like this that I could have shared with you if you were interested. So if you wanted to see like a part 2 of this and hear about more fantasy series that I have that have a lot of really good romances in it, then let me know down in the comment section below, because I'd love to make a part 2 of this if you guys were interested. But either way, I'd love to know if you've read any of these series before and what you thought about them, if you plan to add any of them to your TBR. Let me know. I love chatting with you guys, so feel free to say hi down in the comment section below. But either way, if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're not currently subscribed to my channel, please hit that subscribe button, because it would really put a smile on my face. And like always, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy reading.